In today's episode, we welcome Registered Dietitian Antonella Dewell. We'll discuss her experience helping clients with relief from IBS, the role of nutrition in managing IBS, and effective methods to manage gut health overall. Stay tuned. Antonella is a registered dietitian passionate about helping people with IBS find relief from uncomfortable gut syndromes and pinpoint the foods that are triggering them so they can stop being anxious around food, eat with confidence, and live a full, vibrant life. Welcome, Antonella.
Thank you, Shireen.
Such a pleasure having you on. So, Antonella, let's start with your why. Could you share a little bit more about what drew you to specifically look at IBS and gut health?
I'd be happy to. When I started counseling people one-on-one, I was doing that for a variety of reasons. So I would see people who had either diabetes or heart disease, high cholesterol, and it slowly became more and more evident how many people were actually suffering with gut issues, and especially irritable bowel syndrome. But it was really the experience of one client that really drew me to specialize in this area. It was a one woman who was referred to me because she was suffering with IBS, and her predominant symptom was a really severe diarrhea. And it was so severe that she literally couldn't leave the house unless she took several doses of an antidiarrheal medication because she needed to be close to the bathrooms at all times. She couldn't go to her college classes, to a part-time job. It was very debilitating. This is a issue that can drastically worsen people's quality of life. So at that time, I was already, by coincidence, looking at some research um, on irritable bowel symptoms to comply with those continuing education units that all of us dietitians need to do every few years. And I had come across some research from Monash University in Australia that had sort of pinpointed a dietary strategies to help people with IBS. And I applied these principles with my client, and within 2 weeks, she was no longer suffering from diarrhea. She could discontinue all of her medications. She was free to go about and live her life. And that was so, rewarding. And it was so amazing to see firsthand that I decided this is a group of people who really needs help. And this is where I could be helping them and helping them really quickly, really turn around their lives.
How interesting. Let's maybe take a step back, Antonella, and help us understand a little bit more about what is IBS. Let's start with the definition around it because it seems like such a broad term in terms of
Hmm.
everything it encompasses. Help us define it.
Yeah, this is really important. So IBS is a syndrome. So it's not a disease. And what that means is that structurally, there's nothing wrong with the gut, as seen in the results of blood tests or imaging, or even after doing an endoscopy or a colonoscopy. All these tests come out, so to speak, negative. But it's the gut that's not functioning the way it's supposed to, the way it should. And it's called a disorder of the gut-brain interaction. And what's happening is that, the gut and the brain are always talking, but in the case of IBS, the brain can misinterpret the signals from the gut. And this leads to, you know, uh, the brain, thinking that some normal stimuli like the movement of food or the production of gas or even like a stressful event are actually, you know, um, more than in normal people, and so they're more severe, and then manifest as pain and as irregularity of the gut and bloating and gas. And so it's really a constellation of symptom, and it is characterized mainly by recurring abdominal pain, altered bowel habits. It could be diarrhea, constipation, or a mix of the two. And for most people, also painful bloating and gas. A way to visualize it is I like to think of the gut as a stereo system and that has speakers that are tuned too loud. And so instead of talking to the brain, is screaming, and that manifests as pain and all of these other gut symptoms. So it's a matter of actually turning down those signals and learning for the gut and the brain how to speak to each other, in the
So
way it
what
should.
Yeah, so what you're saying is physically everything looks fine. You
Yeah,
know you go to your GI doctor, they look, they examine, they do, and you mentioned doing an endoscopy. They're doing all of those things. Physically everything's looking fine. It's more of this connection between the mind and the gut, where the
yeah.
gut is screaming something or signaling something much more profoundly than it needs to, which is causing this to happen, to where these symptoms happen. How does one even understand that they have IBS?
Yeah, so it's a good question because I hear from a lot of my clients that sometimes they've had it their whole life and they didn't even know because that they thought that that was their normal. And until, they either talk to somebody and they realize that it's not normal to feel bloated or gassy all the time or to have this irregular bowel movements. Gastroenterology will ask really good questions regarding these symptoms. And the classic pattern is that there needs to be, recurring pain with, either diarrhea or constipation that have been happening consistently for at least 3 months. And so it's not really the occasional. We can all experience these on an occasional basis, but is it the recurring matter? And it happens to a point that it really disrupts the quality of your life.
And that's really the key there, right? Is the quality of life that it can impact, like you mentioned for this patient. Do the symptoms and causes vary from person to person?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, unfortunately, we don't really know what causes IBS, but we do know some of the drivers. Like we talked, the gut-brain miscommunication, the leads to what we call visceral hypersensitivity. So a super sensitive gut. Literally, the nerves around the gut are so sensitive that a little bit of, you know, this tension or bloating can be interpreted as pain. Then there can be imbalance in the makeup of the gut bacteria in our gut. And it also runs in families, so there is a genetic component. And for some people, it can come from an infection, about gastroenteritis, so experiencing food poisoning from which they don't fully recover. Whereas most people, just suffer for a few days and then it's gone. For some people, these symptoms can linger on and then become chronic. Now, the symptoms do present differently. In fact, we actually talk about IBS subtypes. For some people, diarrhea, like the client I just mentioned, is the predominant feature. So we call that IBS-D, diarrhea predominant, or there is the IBS constipation predominant, or they can actually occur, and alternate. So you'll be constipated for many days, and then all of a sudden you have diarrhea. So this is called like the mixed type. And even within these classifications, for some people, the pain is really the worst. From others, is the really severe bloating and gas. It does present differently. Yeah, and no two people are alike.
And which makes it all the more complicated to try to
Hmm.
understand exactly what is going on. What are some common misconceptions about IBS? I also hear there's some taboo around discussing
Yeah,
symptoms, and
yeah.
can you help us understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the longest time, IBS was, you know, dismissed. And luckily we're getting away from this. but it was thought that it's all in your head. And so even doctors would dismiss it and just tell their patients that it's all due to stress and they should stress less, or maybe just try and eat more fiber if they're constipated. Um, but we know from the research now that that's not going on. There's really, changes in how the, brain and the gut interact. We know that IBS is real, and these symptoms really affect people's qualities of life. Nonetheless, I still hear from my clients sometimes that their doctors, will just, tell them that there's nothing they can do for them. And that's the other misconception. There is so much you can do to manage, although it's not a disease that can be cured, there's so much you can manage the symptoms, so much that, you could come to the point where you no longer meet those diagnostic criteria. And so you can really live a life without these symptoms, a full, vibrant life, and do all of the things that you can do.
That's really good to know. Could you explain the strategies you've developed to help clients get relief from IBS? You mentioned this success story as well. What are some of those things associated with
Yeah,
relief?
absolutely. So, what we need to understand about IBS is that it's a multifactorial disorder. And what that means is that there are different things that can trigger these symptoms. And that's also another misconception about IBS, that diet is the only thing that affects your symptoms. Well, diet is a really important part. It's really crucial. But we cannot disregard other things like stress. I think it's on par up there with diet, and your whole lifestyle, you know, how and whether you exercise, how well you sleep, how well you manage your stress, and how you talk to yourself, what goes on in your mind, whether you continuously, you know, telling yourself and talking negatively, like and beating yourself up, or you're talking to yourself with self-compassion. So all of these things I haven't, put them together into my program so that we can, so to speak, attack at IBS on all fronts, and also make sure that the changes and are long lasting, that you can manage IBS for the long term, not just, for a few weeks or a few months, but really that my clients have all of the tools that they can incorporate for the rest of their life and into their life.
You mentioned it's just not about diet and nutrition. That's certainly an element of it. Can you help us understand what is the role that diet and nutrition plays in
Yeah,
relieving or easing the symptoms?
absolutely. And that's where my passion lies, because I am a dietitian after all. So, uh, what really revolutionized this field was some research that Monash University in Australia did um, quite a while ago now, that but only has, become to the front row to the knowledge even of most dietitians in the past 5 to 10 years. And what they discovered, there are certain um, dietary factors, certain sugars and fibers that seem to really trigger the symptoms of pain, bloating, and gas. And so they develop a protocol where you temporarily, eliminate these foods. And they came up with a name that you may have heard of. It's called the FODMAP diet, or FODMAP protocol. And it's a complicated, acronym that stands for fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharide, and polyols. But what it means is really it's certain sugars and certain fibers in certain foods that if you eliminate them for a short period of time and notice that your symptoms have really improved, then you can reintroduce them one by one to really figure out which one is triggering your symptoms. because no two people are alike, so not everyone will react to all of these foods, but everybody has one or two or multiple ones that are triggering their own symptoms. And at the end of this protocol, or you really figure out what are the foods that are triggering your symptoms, so that you can make informed choices when you are eating, whether to maybe not completely eliminate them. I mean, it's rare that really somebody would have to completely eliminate a group of food, but at least minimize them or decrease the portion sizes in a way that will allow you to eat a wider variety of foods, and at the same time not experience these painful symptoms.
What
And
are some Oh, please go ahead.
I wanted to just add to that, that is sort of like the core, principle that really allows people to find the biggest relief. But we cannot neglect other factors in diet. So it's not just what you eat, but also how you eat. That's also very important. Whether you skip meals or you graze all day, or you have some regular meals, whether you eat quickly, or and don't chew your food well, and the environment when you're eating. Are you eating in a hurry? Are you eating in front of the computer, working under stress? As well as other non-FODMAP dietary triggers that we know for a long time can irritate the gut, like alcohol or caffeine. And again, not that everybody needs to, do all of these things, but we need to figure out what's important for that one person, so that then they can know what works for them. So in some, there's like no one size fit all so dietary solution for everybody, but everybody needs to go into this investigative, process to really find out the diet that works the best for them.
I think, you brought up a very interesting point, which is, just going back a little bit, which was, it's not only about what you are eating, but how you are eating. Why is that how so important when it comes to IBS?
Well, part of it is that, our gut likes regularity, it likes consistency. And so, one common mistake is to either skip meals or graze all day. And so our gut seems to prefer some regular meals, and balanced meals too, so that you can actually nourish the gut and give it all the energy and nutrients that it needs to flourish. And then, as far as the IBS symptoms, because they're so much driven by stress too, and think about our modern busy lives that we're jumping from meeting to meeting, from work to family. We're always operating into the, fight or flight response. Even if we are not really feeling, a big stress, that's the mode that we're operating on. So to switch from that to the rest and digest mode, where the parasympathetic system is more active, and so what that means is that in that mode, you know, the stress hormones are dysregulated, and more, um, enzyme are being produced by the gut, more blood flows towards the gut, and that really allows to have the best digestion you can have. And if you're digesting your food well, then you're less likely to experience symptoms like bloating or pain or gas. Um, so all of these things that some of us give for granted, or we're not paying too much attention to, like eating in front of the computer really quickly and not chewing really well. When we chew well, our digestion starts in the mouth already. So we start digesting, the food. So our digestive system down the track has less work to do, and again allows for that optimal digestion.
If there's a listener out there today who's seeming like they may have IBS or know that they have IBS, what are some quick things that you could tell them to sort of reset, either be it slow down or looking at their foods or how they're eating, what they're eating? What are some things that you would impart on them to what they can do to manage their symptoms better today?
Yeah, Yeah, well, I would really start from the how you're eating right now. So look, at your meal pattern. Are you skipping any meals? Or and try to have more regular meals. Um, and are you grazing all day, trying to have more meals that are spaced out so that the gut has that time to rest in between meals? There's a lot that goes on in that rest period to maximize digestion. And my favorite is really, when mealtime comes, try to slow down, have a set time for you to have that breakfast or lunch or dinner, and start by taking 3 deep breaths. Breathing is so easy to do and so undervalued sometimes that we don't think about it because we can do it without thinking about it. But taking some deep diaphragmatic breathings can really switch us from that, fight or flight response into that rest and digest mode and really set us up for that good digestion. And at the same time, eat as slowly as you can, or at least eat not as quickly as you're used to, so you have a chance to chew your food well. So those would be, the the first thing to really start with if you're not already doing. And one thing I would add is stop doing what a lot of people are doing, which is go down this rabbit hole of just looking at food and start eliminating foods. We this is so common, and I hear it from so many of my clients that they come to me and they basically come down to just a handful of foods they eat over and over again because they're too afraid of eating some foods, just because they associated that food with, a bout of symptoms on one day. Just because you eat something and like you maybe, 2 hours later you have diarrhea, that doesn't mean it was that one food. And so there's a little bit more of an investigative process that goes into really figuring out which foods are triggering your symptoms. But just eliminating foods that are random actually can, first, take away a lot of the joy of eating and take out a lot of really great nutrition for you. And so it's completely unnecessary. And second, it doesn't really help you in identifying what foods are triggering those symptoms. And in the long term can actually make your symptoms worse.
Hmm. Which actually takes me to my next question. If IBS goes untreated for a while, what happens? Are there ramifications on that?
The only ramification is that, you're continuing to suffer with the symptoms. So there's nothing, you're not really damaging your gut. As I was saying before, it's not a disease. The fact that you eat something that makes you, um, feel bloated or gassy or gives you pain doesn't damage the gut, but it certainly, disrupts the quality of your life, prevents people from enjoying meals with other people, with their family and friends. Going out to eat is a big issue for people. They end up avoiding, um, get-togethers, birthday parties, just because they're afraid that would be something that they haven't prepared themselves and they don't know how they're going to react. So the biggest repercussion is really on your quality of your life and your mental health, because then you even start isolating yourself, and that has
Hmm.
been shown that people with IBS are more prone to suffering with depression, for example. So it can have repercussions down the line for sure.
In all the experience that you've had working with individuals who've had IBS through your own work, was there anything that has either surprised you or inspired you?
Yeah, well, what surprised me at first, because I wasn't, so aware of it, was how different, every single client is. How I really have still now met two people after, 6 years. I've exclusively seen people with IBS who either react to the same foods, or end up with the same, diet. So it's really an individual disorder and needs to be, And the recommendations need to be individualized. And Also, what inspired me is all the work that all my clients, they get to a point where they can't live with this anymore. And so they're really, that this protocol is not, you know, it's not hard, but it does take some commitment to eliminate some foods at first, and then to do that, detective work of figuring out your trigger foods. And What inspired me is really the great result that people have after completing this process, and it really the people who are really committed end up also having a much more nutritious diet, a much healthier diet, one that's going to help them actually with a lot of other aspects of our health.
How helpful. And I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question here, but what are some useful ways for people to maintain long-term gut health? You talked about having a healthy gut. What does that look like?
Yeah, and so this is really the end goal of this game or not this process that we want to really figure out what our triggers are so that we can expand our diet as much as possible and only like minimize maybe certain foods or once we know what our triggers are, if there is an enzyme that can help us digest that food better, then we know we can utilize that. So what I always tell all of my clients, the best thing you can do is to make sure you keep expanding your diet, and especially, have a variety of plant-based foods, the vegetables, the fruits, the whole grains, the legumes. Not really, eliminate any of those from your diet. Even if you can only have 2 tablespoons of beans, or lentils, keep incorporating those. Because the research has shown really that for our long-term gut health, we need to feed these gut bacteria that are living in our large intestine. And we're finding out more and more from the research how important they are to maintain our gut health, but also our overall health. And so to continue feed those bacteria, their favorite foods are fibers, and fibers come from plants. So the wider variety, the bigger, rainbow you can put on your plate, as far as different colors of fruits and vegetables, um, that's really, the key to long-lasting gut health.
That's so fascinating. Thank you so much, Antonella, for your time here today. Can you tell our listeners how they can connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website, and it's just my name, AntonellaDewell.com. And I'm also active on Instagram and Facebook, and I am at ibs.nutritionist.rd. So those are the best ways.
Lovely. And we'll link up everything in the show notes. Antonella,
Perfect.
thank you so very much for your time. For our listeners today, thank you for joining us on another episode of the Yumlish podcast. You know what time it is. Head over to our social media and answer this quick question. How do you manage your relationship with your gut? Pretty simple, right? Especially after this episode. So head over to @Yumlish on Facebook, on Instagram. Find this podcast post, comment below to tell us again, how do you manage your relationship with your gut? We will continue the conversation there. Antonella, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.